I'm standing in the back of this high school gymnasium of first spring in Japan. It's the graduation ceremony. It's quiet, eerily quiet. The students, all in immaculate black blazers, file in. They're not laughing or talking. They're moving with this silent military precision, each one spaced exactly the same distance apart as they walk toward their seats. The parents are sitting perfectly still, clutching video cameras to their chests. The teachers stand at attention, faces unmoved but totally alert. And it just hit me. This wasn't a celebration, not the way I understood it. This felt like a ritual, an induction. I wasn't just watching kids get their diplomas. I felt like I was watching the final formal step in a long process of becoming Japanese. I'd been sent there to teach English, but I realized pretty quickly that the most important lessons in that building, the ones about harmony, hierarchy, and how to be, weren't written on any blackboard. I was seeing the shadow curriculum. Welcome back to the deep dive. That experience, that sense of a deep-seated ritual, well, that's our launch pad today. Our mission is to look far beyond the textbooks and, the grades. We're diving deep to uncover those powerful, unspoken lessons, that shadow curriculum about harmony, hierarchy, effort, and failure that really define academic life in Japan and, crucially, shape the adult identity that comes out of it.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because the official curriculum, it's actually completely at odds with what really happens day to day. On one hand, you've got MEXT, the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology. And they're always revising goals, trying to develop the whole student, encourage creativity, individuality.
Right, the ideal student.
Exactly. But in practice, that goal gets completely overridden by this rigid counter-curriculum that's focused almost entirely on one thing, preparing for those super high-stakes university entrance exams.
So the government says it wants well-rounded learners, but the system on the ground, it just rewards the best test takers. Is that the gist?
That's precisely it, and it creates this really deeply entrenched dual system. It's driven partly by tradition, but also, frankly, by necessity, because those elite university spots, they're so incredibly limited. So for you, listening, the key insight here isn't just about school performance. We're really digging into the long-term societal implications of this shadow curriculum. How does it affect corporate culture later on? Social cohesion? Even how individuals see themselves. This whole system, it basically defines the pathways to success in modern Japan long after graduation day.
Okay, let's unpack this engine of conformity then. It operates under the crushing weight of a terrifyingly descriptive name. Shikin Jigoku. That means examination hell. And the sources, they're absolutely clear about the stakes involved here. Getting accepted by the right university, and there's apparently a very small, finite list of these right universities, is considered the sine qua non, the absolute necessity for a successful professional life in Japan today.
It really is the gatekeeper. So much of what happens from high school onwards, sometimes even from early middle school, it's all preparation for just a few days of testing. And almost everything that happens after that is a direct result of those tests. If you manage to get into one of that handful of elite institutions, Tokyo University today, or maybe Kyoto University, you've pretty much guaranteed yourself a lifetime trajectory of success.
Whether that's in government or...
Yeah, government bureaucracy, blue chip corporate leadership, high-level finance. You name it.
Yeah.
Your path is basically set.
Now, historically, this sounds a bit like a classic meritocracy.
Yeah.
A necessary sorting mechanism for society. But what we found is that a really strange paradox has emerged when it comes to opportunity and pressure. You'd think maybe that as higher education expanded over the last century, the pressure would ease up a bit.
That's the logical assumption, yeah. But the opposite happened. Before World War II, there were only, 8 imperial universities?
Right.
Today, there are over 450 four-year colleges. That sounds like a massive expansion, loads more opportunity. But actually, that growth has intensified the rigor of Shikin Jigoku.
How so? Why did it get more intense?
Well, because almost none of those 400-plus new institutions have managed to break into the ranks of the elite. They just haven't gained that same prestige.
So the massive expansion didn't really create broad equality of outcome. It created this extreme polarization instead. Like a few top schools and then a huge lower tier competing for relevance.
Exactly right. As one former dean put it, there's now a severe polarization between good and bad schools. And the market, the employers, they've spoken. They are more likely now, not less, to look exclusively to those established elite institutions to fill the top entry-level jobs.
They trust the filter.
They trust the filtering mechanism of the entrance exams at Today or Kyo or Waseda. So for those students who have that top rank potential, the entrance exams become this absolute nightmare because their entire future really hinges on that one score.
And the tests themselves.
Yeah.
They sound like they're designed with this kind of deliberate, almost punishing difficulty. We're not just talking about making sure students understood the curriculum.
No, not at all. There's this growing rivalry, maybe even a bit perverse, among the elite colleges to produce the most confounding, hyper-specific material possible. It's sort of a way for them to say they're ensuring quality students.
It sounds more like a filtration mechanism disguised as an educational assessment.
That's a good way to put it. They say they're trying to measure how many knowledge has been learned and how well information can be applied, but the actual tests, they're often just multiple choice or fill-in-the-blank questions. But they've raised the level of skill and memory required to, well, sky-high proportions, often way beyond any practical requirements of actually studying at university.
Can you give an example of that absurdity? How does it play out?
Okay, so the goal might be to measure deep learning, say, analyzing the economic impact of the Meiji Restoration in history, but the method relies on trivia. So instead of an essay, the question might focus on translating some tiny, obscure passage of Meiji-era calligraphy.
Just because it's hard.
Exactly. It tests an incredibly niche skill purely because it acts as a difficult filter. It forces applicants to sacrifice developing skills they'll actually need in university-like critical thinking, independent research, composition, just to cram for these rote memorization demands.
That sounds incredibly counterproductive.
It is. One professor even said he doubted most university teachers or even graduates could pass the entrance test to their own institutions if they had to take it again. He called the whole system an absurdity. It's just not a sustainable standard.
And that structural pressure must have immense consequences. We really need to talk about the psychological and societal toll of Shiken Jigoku. When a student's entire perceived worth, their future security, rests on a single, absurdly difficult test, well, the stress must be severe.
It's multi-layered, and tragically, the data reveals the cost. Japan actually leads the world in school-related suicides among 15 to 19-year-olds. And this isn't just academic pressure in isolation.
No, it's societal too, right? Failure isn't just personal, it reflects on the whole family.
Precisely. And that societal pressure helps explain why parents sometimes feel driven to stretch or even break the law. Things like falsifying addresses just to get their kids into a high school catchment area that has a better track record on these exams. The competition starts way before the university level.
It starts with getting into the right high school feeder system.
Exactly. And that desperation leads directly to this phenomenon of the Ronin. This might be the most visible human cost of the system.
Explain Ronin for us.
Okay, so Ronin, historically, means a masterless samurai. But in this context, it refers to the growing number of students who fail the entrance exams, specifically for the top-tier schools, and then spend years outside the formal school system just studying. They're preparing for a second or a third or even a fourth attempt.
And this isn't just a few struggling students we're talking about.
No, not at all. The numbers are significant. Back in 1981, for instance, over a third of all admitted university students were actually Ronin. They'd failed at least once before getting in.
A third?
Yeah. And if you're aiming for Tokyo University, today, the absolute peak, the Mount Olympus of Japanese education, taking the exam multiple times is practically the norm. It's almost an expected part of the journey for their really ambitious students.
Just think about the depth of commitment, the sacrifice that involves.
It's huge. A Ronin is often quite isolated. They might attend specialized cram schools called juku, or they might study completely alone. They're bearing this immense financial burden, the emotional weight. They're basically in limbo.
Right. They've finished high school, but they haven't got that necessary social status of being a university student.
Exactly. They are literally putting their youth and often their family's financial stability on hold, all for the chance to get into that elite club.
It really speaks to the power of that initial promise of meritocracy, doesn't it? Historically, exams were brought in during the Meiji Restoration as a vital sorting mechanism for society.
They were. They offered a pathway for upward mobility in post-feudal Japan, and they really spurred the country's climb towards near-universal school enrollment. In those early days, school probably felt like the one place where everyone could be equal, judged just on their intellect and how hard they worked.
A crucial social and political tool.
Definitely. But since World War II, that drive for status seems to have warped the system. The principle of fair competition, objective assessment, which was supposed to be about mobility, has, as one panel noted, kind of deteriorated into mere techniques of measuring the amount of knowledge by uniform standards.
Yeah.
It completely fails to assess individuality or diverse abilities.
So the original meritocratic promise got replaced by this uniform, rigid assessment factory that just prioritizes the sheer volume of memorized facts over genuine intellectual capability.
Pretty much. And this is where that structural rigidity really meets the mental toll.
Which brings us directly to mindset and the core of the shadow curriculum. What kind of thinking does it instill?
Right, because the overwhelming pressure forces secondary teachers to basically ignore the official holistic MEXT curriculum. They can't afford to. Instead, they focus relentlessly on test-taking strategies.
Teaching to the test.
Exactly. The result, as one study rather bluntly put it, is that the system gets reduced to an enormously elaborated, very expensive Tesla system with some educational spin-offs. Education becomes secondary to the testing.
And if the entire system is built around finding the one right answer, the mindset it fosters must be inherently fixed, right?
That's what students overwhelmingly report. Success is seen as being down to innate, unchangeable talent. You're either a genius or you're not. Results are prized way above the actual learning process. And there's constant social comparison, which is often made worse by things like publicly posting test scores or rankings.
It sounds brutal. If you believe intelligence is fixed and you're consistently ranked low, your effort must feel, well, meaningless.
Why bother? Exactly. Why invest thousands of hours if the outcome seems predetermined by some innate talent you just don't have? Students report feeling that no matter how hard they try, if they don't hit that top score, they must just be inadequate. They internalize that feeling, even if they've made huge personal improvements from one test to the next.
Because the external benchmark is the only thing that matters.
It's the only thing that counts in the system.
Okay, but that sounds incredibly demoralizing. How does a culture that places such a huge emphasis on intense discipline and effort on Doryoku square that level of systematic demoralization?
Now this is where we hit a really fascinating cultural paradox. Researchers have looked at Japanese students compared to, say, North American or Western students, and they've observed a critical difference in how they're motivated, especially when facing setbacks.
Okay, tell us about the Western response first.
North Americans typically show what's called a self-enhancement tendency. They tend to persist longer after success. They feel better, more confident after a win. Their motivation is heavily tied to protecting their ego, demonstrating their competence. They're really driven by that feeling of success.
Yeah, makes sense, but the Japanese response is different.
Markedly different. It points to a very distinct cultural way of interpreting failure. They displayed what researchers called a self-improving orientation.
Self-improving, how does that work?
Well, they actually persisted longer and worked harder after failure than they did after success.
Really, after failing?
Yes. In their view, the failure highlights the specific shortcoming. It shows them precisely where corrective efforts are needed. And get this, they didn't rate the task as less important after failing it. In fact, they often rated the task as more important and more diagnostic after failing.
So let me get this straight. If I fail a math test, the sort of Western approach might be, maybe I'm just not good at math, or maybe I downplay how important the test was to protect my self-worth. But the Japanese approach is more like, okay, this test has accurately shown me the gaps in my effort or understanding, and now I absolutely must redouble my concentration to fix those specific deficiencies.
That's the core difference. So while the system itself fosters a fixed mindset through all the rankings and the focus on results, the cultural response to the actual experience of failure is often to activate persistence. Failure is seen less as a reflection on your innate personal worth, and more as a detailed map showing where your dedicated effort, your doryoku, needs to be applied to achieve mastery.
That sounds like a really powerful societal mechanism for creating persistence. But if the system is so rigid and failure is just a map for doing the same thing harder, where does the motivation to try genuinely new things come from? The kind of trial and error needed for innovation.
That's a great question, and it points to another psychological constraint that really complicates this picture: the powerful cultural aversion to meiwaku.
Right, meiwaku. We should probably spend a moment defining that. It translates roughly as being a burden or a nuisance to others, but the cultural weight behind it is immense, isn't it?
Oh, it's much stronger than just, being an inconvenience. It's a deep-seated social taboo. And a few students in these studies actually cited the fear of meiwaku as a key source of their fixed mindset when it came to making mistakes.
So it's not just about personal embarrassment if you fail.
No, the profound fear is that your mistake will inconvenience someone else, impose a burden, or disrupt the harmony of the group, whether that's the class, your family, your sports team.
And since group cohesion and conformity are so highly valued in Japan, and the whole social structure really emphasizes smooth interaction, that fear must act as a kind of systemic brake on risk-taking.
Absolutely. Think about it. If an experiment might require public failure, if learning a new language means stumbling over words in front of others, if asking a question might slow down the pace of the class for everyone else, the pressure to avoid meiwaku makes students really afraid to take those kinds of risks in public.
They stick within the established boundaries.
Right. They prioritize not rocking the boat over trying new, potentially disruptive things. This reluctance to try something where you might visibly stumble or fail is a critical constraint. If risk-taking and making errors are actually required for true innovation, then this cultural imperative creates a profound systemic brake on those very behaviors.
That fear of meiwaku and the need for that intense group synchronization seems to take us right into the heart of the school's social training grounds. I'm thinking about the unspoken lessons taught outside the classroom, specifically in Bukatsuru, school clubs.
Yes, Bukatsuru. These clubs, covering everything from baseball and kendo to the calligraphy and tea ceremony, they're incredibly powerful, long-established institutions in Japanese schools. They're generally not optional extras. They're seen as a central part of school life.
And crucially, they're mostly run by the students themselves, right?
That's key. Typically, it's the second and third year students who run things day to day. Teachers are there more as supervisors, the ultimate authorities, but the students manage the operations.
And the commitment required sounds intense. It rivals the commitment needed for exam prep, doesn't it?
It really does. Clubs often demand full devotion. Daily practice, maybe from 4 to 6 p.m., sometimes even longer, often 6 days a week, including maybe half days on weekends.
Wow.
And this intensity isn't accidental. The structure actively promotes that strong cultural belief that a person should pursue only one thing at a time with full commitment. You see the same kind of focus and intensity applied here as you do to shiken jigoku. Some sources even mention historical examples like fencing clubs where members practiced every single day purely as a test of will and stamina.
Okay, so if the academic track is training students in solitary endurance for a big exam, then the club track is training them for communal endurance, but within a very strict organizational structure.
That's a perfect way to put it. These clubs are absolutely crucial for social and moral development. They teach ningen kankei, that's human relationships, and shakaisei, or social skills, the things you absolutely need to navigate the Japanese social order.
And you see that hierarchy playing out strongly.
Oh, absolutely. There's a strict observance of hierarchy between older and younger students, the senpai-kohai relationship. It's rigidly enforced through specific rituals, language use, duties, and these are the exact patterns that you see replicated almost seamlessly in Japanese corporate culture later on.
So in a way, Bukatsuru is like the ultimate 3-year full-time corporate training program, just disguised as after-school activities, instilling that deep respect for seniority and rank that will govern their careers.
In many ways, yes. The third-year students, the senpai, command almost absolute obedience from the first years, the kohai. But, and this is important, it all happens within this really intense atmosphere of close comradeship. They enforce the structure, sure, but they're all working towards a shared communal goal, like winning a tournament or putting on a performance.
Preparing them for that rigid yet intensely loyal environment of a big Japanese company.
Exactly. But it also serves another critical function. Beyond just social conditioning, you touched on it earlier, it offers a kind of dignity that the purely academic testing system often takes away. Well, it operates kind of like an apprenticeship-style learning model.
Right.
It's what educational theorists might call legitimate peripheral participation. It allows students to gain respect and status by developing mastery and talents outside of the academic grind, which, as we've said, is solely focused on those standardized test scores.
So if you're not great at math or history, according to the tests, you can still achieve status and respect by being a phenomenal team captain or a brilliant musician in the band.
Precisely. It provides an alternative pathway to gaining dignity and a sense of belonging.
And interestingly, despite that rigorous hierarchy within the clubs themselves, the general public school atmosphere maintains surprisingly strong egalitarian tendencies, doesn't it?
It does. Unlike, say, some U.S. schools, entry to most Japanese clubs isn't based on competitive tryouts. Generally, everyone who wants to join a particular club joins. Usually not for basic membership. The school environment as a whole really emphasizes equal treatment and cooperation. Those kind of rigid status categories that often plague American high schools, the jock, the nerd, the preppy, they're generally much less salient, much less obvious in the Japanese school environment.
What about kids who don't fit in?
Well, the main widely recognized negative category was often fury. That means basically a rebellious student, someone who actively refused to participate in the cooperative order of the school or the club.
Okay, so we have these two powerful curricula running side by side. The academic track, super high stakes, fiercely competitive, potentially polarizing, demanding solitary memorization. And then the social track, bukatsuru, immersive, hierarchical, but ultimately cooperative, focused on shared development and fitting into the group. The whole system seems perfectly designed to produce excellent, highly disciplined employees who prioritize group harmony above all else.
It's incredibly effective at doing that. And that very success leads us directly to the modern paradox we need to explore. How does this consensus-driven, process-oriented system stack up in a rapidly globalizing service economy? An economy that increasingly demands innovation, critical thinking, and spontaneous communication skills.
And the answer we found seems pretty sobering. Despite decades of government policy goals aimed at internationalization, trying to develop 21st century skills, the system struggles profoundly. Why? Because that entrance examination system remains the single dominant variable overriding everything else.
The English education paradox is the perfect, maybe tragic microcosm of this systemic failure. Japan consistently ranks lowest or among the lowest in Asia for standardized English proficiency tests like the TOEFL, often below some developing nations.
It is bizarre because
they possess the largest commercial English language education market in the world. It was valued at something like US $20 billion way back in the year 2000. All that massive financial investment yields some of the lowest communicative returns in the region.
that's just an absurd deficiency, given the money and time poured in. So the problem isn't a lack of resources, it's the methodology. The approach is entirely driven by the exam needs.
Exactly. English is treated almost purely as an academic exercise, something designed to be tested via written exams. So the instruction focuses almost exclusively on things like intricate grammar mastery, highly technical vocabulary lists, translation exercises, skills you need to pass the written tests.
But not skills you need to actually talk to someone.
Precisely. It completely disregards communicative competencies. The result is often described as rote learning and absolute correctness. Students focus on getting the grammar perfect on paper, avoiding any mistakes.
So they might be able to master the rules of the language. They could translate a complex passage, maybe identify the passive pluperfect tense.
Oh, yeah. Technically, their knowledge can be quite deep in that sense.
But if you put them in a real-world situation, say a Starbucks in London, they might just freeze up. Unable to order a coffee, because that requires taking a risk, adapting, maybe making a small error, things the classroom never trained them for.
That's a very common scenario described. And this creates serious real-world challenges, not just for individuals traveling, but for higher education within Japan and for Japanese corporations trying to compete globally. Many Japanese universities are experimenting with English medium programs, trying to attract international talent and prepare their own students.
But how's that working out?
Well, they report that domestic Japanese students often have significant trouble keeping up, not just with the English language level, but with the modes of discourse used by international students and professors. They struggle to participate in debates. They find it hard to spontaneously negotiate meaning. They have difficulty with the ambiguity that comes with genuine, unscripted interaction.
Because they've been trained for certainty and correctness above all else.
Right. And that failure then connects to the somewhat superficial nature of the government's big internationalization efforts. They set these ambitious goals, like aiming for 300,000 foreign students by 2020. But often these students end up being viewed primarily as a source of revenue.
Filling seats in under-enrolled universities.
That's often a major factor. And the integration is minimal. The curricula designed for these foreign students are frequently segregated into short-term, self-contained English programs. Domestic Japanese students rarely have opportunities for meaningful intercultural contact or interaction within the classroom setting.
So they're sharing a campus, maybe, but not really sharing an educational experience.
In many cases, no, which means simply increasing the number of international students on Japanese soil doesn't automatically translate into truly internationalizing the education itself, nor does it magically develop the critical thinking or communication skills needed to thrive in a global marketplace.
And if domestic graduates can't function effectively in an internationalized classroom or later in an international corporate environment, Japan really risks falling further behind regional competitors like China and South Korea, doesn't it? Countries that seem to be rapidly producing graduates who are perhaps more ready for global commerce.
That's the core concern. This systemic rigidity needs to be addressed. And interestingly, the people who seem most qualified to comment on the needed solutions are the students themselves. Participants in these studies, they've provided very clear, very actionable suggestions for how to foster more of a growth mindset culture, and their suggestions speak volumes about what they feel they're currently missing.
What stands out immediately is how central the whole concept of failure is to their suggestions. It seems like a direct response to that cultural aversion to error, to meiwaku. First, they emphasize the need to, well, normalize mistakes and failure.
Exactly. They want supportive, safe environments where failure is genuinely seen as essential for growth, not as a source of shame or criticism or burdening the group. This is a direct attempt to counter that deep-seated fear associated with academic setbacks. They want trying and failing to be seen not as inconveniencing others, but as benefiting the individual's learning journey.
Makes sense. Second, they're demanding a shift to prioritize process over results.
Yes. They want the focus moved away from those external benchmarks, the public rankings, which just reinforce the fixed mindset. They want evaluation to look at individual effort, at incremental improvement, at personal growth. They want their hard work recognized, even if they aren't the absolute top scorer, because that effort, that struggle, is where the real learning actually happens.
Third, they advocate for holistic learning.
Right. They want the system to genuinely value non-academic achievement, things like sports, research projects, extracurriculars. They want the system to help develop unique strengths rather than focusing solely on those standardized test scores. This really acknowledges the dignity that can be found in Bukatsuryu, but they want that value applied more broadly so that being skilled in something other than test-taking doesn't automatically relegate you to a lower status.
And finally, and this one's really interesting, they want help fostering a clear academic identity.
Yeah, this is crucial. Because high school is such a rigid, all-consuming preparation for the exam, there's very little room left for personal exploration, for figuring out what you're actually interested in. Students feel they need help finding a clear academic identity and a sense of purpose earlier on.
Because the transition to university must be terrifying otherwise.
Yeah, it often is. Suddenly, they have autonomy. They have to decide what they want to study, pursue independent research, and it can be incredibly confusing and overwhelming because they've only ever been trained to follow directions and memorize facts for the next test. They haven't had practice in self-direction.
These solutions, coming from the students, they speak directly to the urgency of adapting, don't they?
Yeah.
Especially adapting to this shifting, service-based global economy.
They really do. The traditional strengths of the Japanese system, that incredible persistence, the focus on process within groups, the strong social cohesion, those are undeniable. But they're now being countered by this global demand for independent thought, for creativity, for rapid, flexible innovation.
So wrapping this up, we really see this fascinating paradox, don't we? The Japanese educational system is, in many ways, incredibly successful. It creates remarkable social cohesion, and it fosters that high degree of persistence, especially that unique cultural trait of persisting harder after failure. It produces incredibly dedicated, meticulous individuals perfect for certain roles.
Absolutely. Yet that very rigidity, the system that achieves all that, simultaneously stifles the creativity, the critical thinking, the risk-taking, and the communicative competency that are becoming increasingly necessary for Japan to maintain its competitiveness in this rapidly globalizing service-based economy. You could say the system is structurally brilliant at preparing people for the manufacturing-based economy of the past.
But it's struggling to adapt to the knowledge-based economy of the future.
That's the challenge it faces.
The shadow curriculum, it seems, has done its job incredibly well for generations, prioritizing stability and the needs of the collective. But the ultimate enduring lesson it imparts, perhaps, is that learning how to belong, how to persist within the structure, and how to conform. Well, that's often prioritized over nurturing individual genius or fostering deep academic curiosity. And that intricate system of unwritten rules, that intense pressure we've talked about, it profoundly defines and shapes a national identity that lasts far, far beyond the day those quiet graduates file out of the gymnasium for the very last time.